return to our island. And that's good. The part that makes us unhappy is you could be.
Could be? What?
And there isn't anything you can do to stop her. You'll all get hurt. That's what makes us sad. All you good ones are sure to be hurt.
Who? Stop who?
What is it? Mothra, she'll soon be here.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me as always is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
So we're going to be closing out our month in the feminine monstrous by going a little big with it. We decided to watch Mothra from 1961. This is only our second Japanese monster movie we're watching, and our first really big, giant monster movie. Dad, you had said while we were watching it that you didn't really remember any details from it, but you thought you might have seen it at some point.
I saw it. I just don't remember any part of the beginning. The most I remember is the part where it forms this cocoon and they try to fry it and then it ends up incubating it.
Yeah.
So
that's the
the only
thing.
part
Yeah,
that
I don't think that was the intent of the scene. I don't think it quite incubates the pupa, but it's you could understand being a kid watching the movie and getting that impression. But
right.
So this is 1961's Mothra. Just as a forewarning, that once again I'm going to be hit for sound bites. I'm going to have to be drawing from the English language dub. This is once again a dub that was done by Columbia Pictures, who also distributed The H-Man, which we covered a while ago. Once again, the people who dubbed the movie decided to do those really racist, chinky Chinaman accents while they were dubbing the voices instead of just dubbing them like human beings. So that's something to be forewarned about. But otherwise, it pretty much captures the tenor of the time, but doesn't really get in the way of extrapolating plot details. The one thing though is that I guess I picked this one for a sort of feminine monstrous movie because I always associate Mothra with being a girl monster. In all of the annals of giant monsters, there are very few ones that are explicitly female. In fact, the only other one I can think of is Gorgo.
Right, the mother. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the mother Gorgo.
But the twins call her a he.
That's the thing. In the subtitles that we saw, they call her a he.
Right.
But the thing about it is, and again, I'm not that familiar with the Japanese language, but my understanding is that the Japanese language lacks binary universal gender pronouns. That when pronouns are used, it's a lot more... it's not that gendered pronouns don't exist, it's just that pronouns by their very nature in the Japanese language are used a lot more sparingly, traditionally, because it's a lot more bound up in context, in terms of formality and politeness. You wouldn't just... if you're referring to someone who's not present, you wouldn't just say, well, he wouldn't like this, because it's considered impolite to refer to someone impersonally without naming them when they're not present. So obviously I don't know very much about the Japanese language, but I'm wondering if it might have been
I always thought it was a female.
I mean, and that's the thing. Part of it is maybe it's just because it's a butterfly that you see a giant pretty butterfly. Well, moth, but right. Okay, but you see a giant pretty moth,
right? And
you assume, I guess maybe it is just an ingrained, just sort of cultural connotation. You just kind of assume that Mothra is a lady, but then again, I guess giant monsters don't really have gender, do they? It's no one ever really.
Well, Godzilla, you say it's a male, right?
Right.
I don't know if that's, but they're right. There's no gender.
Well,
associated with it.
I would call Godzilla he if
Right.
I'm talking about a character.
The only time you really see it is when the latest Godzilla movie, where you have the male and female archetypal creatures.
Oh yeah, the Mutos in the 2014.
Right. So that's the
film.
only time you really see.
Yeah, that's the weird thing. That's like one of the.
You don't know whether it's.
That's one of the weird things. It's only really
got 3 heads, so it could be all 3 heads.
That's the thing. It speaks to the kind of weird sexual hang-ups that come with all of these like really juvenile monster movies. Is that it isn't really until it really isn't until after Jurassic Park that any of these sort of monster or creature features get into like the actual question of like monster sexual reproduction.
Right.
Because even Mothra, I guess you could say that Mothra lays an egg sometime in between.
Godzilla's female, because we know in the remake, there are eggs that are left underground, right?
Well, okay, let me just tease this out. So, like, Jurassic Park comes along. We have the plot element of, well, how do we control the sexuality of the dinosaurs so that they don't just breed out of control and take over the Earth or whatever. And they say, well, let's just make them all female.
Right.
But then the frog DNA that is
Right.
in them mutates them so that they can reproduce asexually.
Life finds a way.
Right, exactly. They're, like, because all
female sexes can convert
to male sex under certain genetic
or
conditions.
temperature, like certain amphibians.
Right, exactly, which is the premise of that movie.
Right, or they're parthenogenetic, like some lizards.
Right, and that's a movie where it's the context of dinosaurs. That's a movie where it's the context of a theme park. So there's a kind of like a mechanical reason why like questions of reproduction would come up.
Right.
Then 1998 American Godzilla comes out, the Sony TriStar film or the Paramount
Not a bad film.
No, I agree too. I don't think it has a kind of a bad reputation, but I think that's mostly because people are just holding it up to like this iconic character.
They don't like Hank Azaria. No, I don't know.
No, listen, Hank Azaria is one of the saving graces of that film.
It's true.
Listen, if that whole movie was just Hank Azaria as this stereotypical Guido with his WAP girlfriend just screaming and running from the monster, if it was basically just a screwball New York comedy that happened to have a giant monster in it, that would have been way more entertaining than fucking what's his face from War Games and his... No. You know, like that, like you could have easily, anyway, but my point being is that
Bradley Crawford.
Right.
I mean...
Matthew Broderick. Bradley Crawford.
He's dead. I'm going way back.
Oh, boy.
Go ahead.
But anyway, so my point being is that, so we get, because it's, in a clear ripoff of Jurassic Park, they introduced the plot contrivance in that Godzilla is both sexually male and sexually female, and therefore it can reproduce asexually. And so this is the first giant monster movie where sex even comes into the equation. Right. Nobody in previous giant monster movies is ever worrying themselves about whether there's a giant monster.
Whoa, it's always Rodan. There are 2 sexes. We don't find out to the end that there were 2 sexes, but Rodan.
Right, I guess that is true. Rodan has a mommy and a mama and a papa.
Sure.
But here's the thing: is that like the interesting thing with Rodan is that it even is kind of obscurantist because what we see in the beginning of the film, like most of the film isn't even about the Rodan. Because most of the film is about these bugs that live in this mine, these like giant metal, whatever they're called. They're giant caterpillars, basically. They're giant worms that live in the earth.
Centipedes.
Prehistoric centipedes that are killing these miners. And then we get a flashback of one of the characters who's brought out of a mine collapse.
Right.
We see Rodan hatching from a giant egg.
Right.
But then in a few days later, we see a grown up Rodan.
Right.
And so that's the weird thing is that I'm not sure if we're supposed to assume that that's how fast Rodan grow, or if that original Rodan was the child of the other 2.
Right.
Rodan.
You really don't know. It doesn't really matter. The idea is they feed off the giant centipedes. Big bird, giant centipedes goes with it.
And that's the thing. Yeah. Who knows how fast Rodan grow? Right. It's it's the same thing with Mothra.
No one sees Mothra eat.
Right, exactly. No one sees any of these animals eat. We do see Rodan eat and destroy all monsters. Rodan eats a whale and destroy all monsters, but that's the only time I remember ever seeing a giant monster eat. Right. But just on the trip of Mothra, in the first film, it's just Mothra. She hatches from an egg as a caterpillar. Where the egg came from, who knows? But the egg is this, and this is a very common motif in these movies, where the egg is just fully formed and it's encased in stone somewhere. It's either in a mountain or on an island.
Well, there's a god aspect to it, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's much more of this sort of magical realist. Like, there's no real scientific explanation. And then in the second time Mothra appears in Mothra vs. Godzilla in 1964, we have grown-up Mothra, which is presumably the same Mothra as in the first film.
Correct, it is, right.
But then we see that it has an egg, which hatches 2 little baby Mothras. And so presumably Mothra can reproduce and give birth. And so that kind of reinforces its female... But you're right, it isn't really until, like, the late 20th and 21st century that we start to see, like... And again, it's only in the American films. It's only in American films where we see, like, the concept of monsters breeding. It's only in American films where you see a character, like, again, in a ripoff of Jurassic Park, saying that, like, Godzilla is a he, but he's a very unusual he. He has both male and female reproductive organs. And they keep calling him a he, you know, despite the fact that, you know, so they have... I don't know, but potentially someone had opportunity to observe its giant 10-meter genitalia under its legs or something, but, like, you know, so the point is that, like, this is a very American construct of this idea, and a very much of a late 20th century, 21st century construct. Where,
well,
like,
it's what they want to be more real. I think they're trying to be more...
Right, more scientifically realistic.
More realistic.
Right. But it's also, but that's the thing, it's like, it's also rooted in the fact is that we in American culture are, you know, it didn't used to be this way, but we're now much more used to a culture of science fiction, of that variety, which is very much about technology and of mechanism. So it isn't even so much that you need an explanation of sexual reproduction. It's just that, like, sex is almost like this mechanical thing that, like, requires explanation in American movies. Whereas in Japan, even after the 90s Godzilla movies, no one ever talks about this in Japanese giant monster movies. No one cares. It's always presupposed that the monsters are just like these innate entities that defy all convention. So on the one hand, like, I guess technically Rodan isn't, or no, not Rodan, but Mothra technically isn't like a female monster. I think we could still say that it's like an example of the feminine monstrous. And it's very much, it goes back to the very sort of primordial, like, symbolic notion of the idea of the feminine monstrous, which is this idea of there being this, especially in a society that is dominated by men, there being this sort of pathological fear of femininity as being associated with nature, right? Where it's like, you know, like the Cartesian principle, where, like, a masculinity is associated with the mind and control over one's urges and control over nature and manipulating nature to his will, and femininity is associated with uncontrolled nature. It's associated with nature defying rationality and science and feeding off its urges. And that's very much like the kind of binary conflict at play here, because you see with Mothra like the sort of the conventional man versus nature story, don't you? It's like which in itself isn't so strange for, like, a Japanese giant monster movie of this period, but, like, I do think it bears repeating, like, just how flamboyant Mothra is compared to previous Toho giant monster movies. That's the studio that made it, Toho Studios. But, like, you know, before Mothra, you know, there was Godzilla in 1954, followed by a quick cash grab sequel in 1955. You know, at that point, nobody thinks that it's Godzilla in particular that's popular. They just think, all right, we've got a formula that we can exploit for other movies, and so you get Rodan in 1956, you get Varan the Unbelievable in 1958, and all of the monsters are very much of that Godzilla type. They're all reptilian in nature. They're all sort of associated with dinosaurs. Like, you know, it's the... And all of them sort of follow the same pattern. It's the monster sort of rises. There's also like obviously an overarching like nuclear fixation, like the anxiety of nuclear proliferation, with Godzilla itself being a very explicit anti nuclear proliferation allegory. But even in like the personifications of the monsters, there's very much this almost like masculinist portrayal of them. And I guess like you even see that in like the title of the American version, because obviously the Japanese movie is just called Godzilla, but when it comes to America, some enterprising American distributor comes up with the idea of saying Godzilla, King of the Monsters. So like obviously that person, they're not just transposing this thing willy-nilly. Like they're saying to themselves, well, clearly Godzilla is some sort of T-Rex. Tyrannosaurus Rex is the king of the tyrant lizards. Clearly Godzilla is the king of the monsters. But,
right, but what happened to the, what do you call it, Daikaiju, where they actually are, when he talks about the explanation that they begin as animals that grow and live in fire.
Oh, you're thinking of like that's from Godzilla. That's from the American edit of Godzilla Raids Again, Gigantus the Fire Monster. There's like a whole beginning where the character explains. So
it's really hard to explain why they go back and forth between this fixation about. Of course, the more modern Godzilla is due to an iguana that changes into Godzilla.
Well, the 1998 one,
right? But here. They go back and forth. It's about this kind of fear or fixation on nuclear energy, like you're talking about, their fallout, and also the fact that the guy explains that they're really not. They're actually just some kind of series of creatures that live in depths of fire.
Well, again,
within the center of the earth somewhere.
Again, I think that's closer to the American version. I think that's closer to the American sensibility of displacing the source of the problem from the modern one, which we as the Americans are uniquely responsible for.
Because in the first Godzilla, they find a trilobite, right? A living trilobite, right?
But you are right. It's not so much that it's like always, and this is what made Godzilla unique, and what makes all of the foregoing sort of daikaiju, the Japanese giant monster movies so unique. It's their very unique balancing of the same sort of overtures of scientific rationalism in terms of explaining what the monster is and what it's doing there. Usually radiation is the culprit in some form, but always balanced with this idea that the monster itself is just an expression of what was always latent in nature. That, like, even Godzilla, immediately the natives of the island are like, it's like, this is just Godzilla. We've known about Godzilla for a long time. Right. Our ancestors used to sacrifice virgins to Godzilla. It was just a thing we did, and now Godzilla's back and he's angry. Presumably, in Rodan, the scientist speculates that radiation might have something to do with it, but again, it's the same thing with Mothra, and the same thing,
after all, we did bomb Japan.
Well, we bombed it twice, but it's like this,
all
the Pacific waters that we kept bombing routinely throughout the 40s and well into the 50s.
We're checking for tests and things.
Yeah. And it's like obviously,
Atoll, right?
But that's the thing. It's like the loose scientific rationality is there, but the actual image we have is not of an extant creature that has merely been mutated or been made sick. In Rodan and in Mothra, what we have is literally just a giant egg that is almost primordially encased in the rock's face. It's like, how did it even get there? It's like, how many eons has this thing just been waiting?
Right.
So there's always this eerie balance between the idea of the monsters being representatives of unique contemporary problems and the idea is that they're like mythological beings, that they're representative of like, even you could even suggest that it's almost like Japan's own expression of its own conflicted cultural consciousness as this nation that sort of spent a gigantic amount of its history in profound isolation to the rest of the world, not just the European and Western world, but also to Asia, but then slowly matriculates all of these different influences that are constantly in conflict, not just because of dangers like of pollution or nuclear proliferation, not just because of like, like trauma of war or things like that, but just from like the basic anxiety of like this idea of something internal and integral to the very nature of like the soil and of the earth and of your relation to it.
Well,
And
it's
this
nature.
right, this idea, but the idea that nature itself has been perverted, that it's being turned into, it's like, and that's the thing with Rodin, is that the thing that makes Rodin interesting is that the main plot of Rodin before the subplot of Rodin before Rodin even appears is that there's this extramarital, there's this premarital relationship that's blooming between one of the people who works at the mining company and this like the daughter of like someone else in the movie. And like you'll have like these brief glimpses, like the characters will say hi to each other, but then they'll look over their shoulders and there'll be these two ladies spying on them and like shaking their heads like tut tut tut, two unmarried adult men and women flirting with one another. So like there's almost this, and then of course what happens in the movie is that these two fully formed male and female Rodan erupt from the earth and start going on a killing spree. Like there's a whole sort of theme of like repression in Rodan, and this idea, and I think that you could say the same thing about a lot of these early Japanese giant monster movies, is that, on one hand, they are sort of allegorical. They're about, like, it's like, don't mess, the cliches. Don't mess with nature. Don't contaminate the earth. Respect the environment. There's that part of it. But there's also just, like, the spectacular destruction. There's also just, like, the simple voyeuristic pleasure of watching these monsters just run rampant and destroy tons of things that... I wonder on a certain level of, like, if that's just endemic. Like, there's something within us that, like, we want to see this sort of destruction happen just because it's pleasing on its face. And, like, I don't know, did you, like, were you a particular fan of these giant monster movies when you were a kid, or were you more acquainted with, like, the American style of horror and science fiction?
No, I think they both serve different purposes. If you want real horror, you go to the American. If
Right.
you want to have fun watching monsters wreck things, then you go to the Japanese films.
Right. Yeah, it's very, like, Susan Sontag says this about, she had an essay about, like, sort of defining science fiction, and I forget the name of it, and I'll cite it in the show notes, but, she, in that essay, when she's sort of teasing out the generic conventions of science fiction and trying to identify their, like, main thematic preoccupation, she's particularly, fond of Japanese giant monster movies because she sees them as distilling two aspects of monster movies from the science fiction films from the 50s and the 60s. One is anxiety over the atomic bomb. That it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a monster from the Earth's core. It could be a meteorite about to crash into the Earth. It could be aliens from the dark side of the moon. Fundamentally, all of these films are speaking to anxieties about the only... the unique existential threat that comes from awareness that you're living in the atomic age, that you're living in the age of literal world-ending weaponry. And the second one is the spectacular destruction as a way of mitigating that anxiety, that simply by seeing the destruction... and then it carried through a narrative in which you're brought to a catharsis and a satisfactory conclusion where, the good guys emerge victorious, we learn valuable lessons from the good scientists, yada, yada, yada. That sort of mitigates the anxiety of living under a constant state of feeling like at any moment we could all just get blown up. And so she looks at Japanese giant monster movies and she notes the irony of that clearly here is a nation that has the most reason to be anxious about the current state of the world, But here is also the nation where their movies show the most profound fixation on and the most distilled, brilliant sort of ingenuity in just showing destruction. That, like, it's like, what is this? What is this? It's like, it's like it's almost like, the extent of catharsis is proportional to the presence of the anxiety. That, like, the sheer, like the sheer destructiveness of, like, a Godzilla or a Rodan is proportional to just how fixed and present your anxieties are in your own mind. That, like, the doomsday clock is only, like, a few minutes from midnight. That, like, at any moment, like, this all could go to waste. As far as Mothra, though, there's obviously, a few necessary differences. As number one, that, like, Mothra is a much, when they made Mothra, at this point, so in the 1950s, they had made a lot of, Tomoyuki Tanaka was the guy who was basically the de facto head of Toho Studios, and he was in charge of a lot of these movies. He usually worked with the same wheelhouse of the director Ishiro Honda, who had done Godzilla. He would also do 7 more sequels in between 1962 and 1975 involving Godzilla, and also Eiji Tsuburaya, who was the special effects man behind a lot of these movies. So Tanaka, Honda, Tsuburaya, sort of the main trio of these kinds of films. From the 50s up to about 59, we sort of see the same kind of pattern of more seriously focused, more sort of scientifically bent, darker, allegorical science fiction films. But what ends up happening is that, in the 1960s, they're now looking for novelty. They're looking for a way to, keep audiences interested. And suddenly it occurs to them that, like, why don't we do one of these monster movies that is less focused on science, less focused on contemporary affairs, less focused on political themes, and let's just make a fun sort of fantasy light adventure film. And so Mothra sort of comes out of that. And, you sort of notice the main differences, the sort of main differences between the movies emerge when you notice, like, the differences between the screenwriters responsible for most of these films. So, like, before Mothra, most of the like the tokusatsu, the special effects movies that were made for Toho Studios, most of them were written by a guy named Takeshi Kimura. So he wrote Rodan, he wrote The Mysterians, he wrote The H-Man, he wrote The Human Vapor, and a nuclear disaster film called The Last War. Now, Kimura, he was a pessimistic leftist who had, he hid his membership in the Japanese Communist Party when he went to work for Toho. He was notorious for not really fitting in with the studio culture. And as soon as the sort of 60s started to roll around and he was being, contracted to basically write much fluffier, less serious, science fiction work, he started using a pen name because he just sort of realized that, like, this is just work for hire. This is not a legitimate creative expression on my part. Mothra, who they bring in to write this film, is a guy named Shinichi Sekizawa. Now, he's known for being a very eccentric figure, a very breezy guy. Like, this is like the 1960s or the late 50s, 1960s in Tokyo, and he's walking around in a kimono. Like, he's going into business meetings in a kimono and sandals. Like, he likes to dress very traditionally, but he's also, like, he's also very modern in a lot of ways. Like, he'll smoke cigarettes in offices when it's still uncouth to do so. Like, he's very much this light, breezy guy. And so this is the guy they get to do Mothra. So Tanaka commissioned a radio play and writer and novelist named Shinichiro Nakamura to make a novel that basically just to craft a new monster for them. He just wants a novel new monster, one that's totally different from, like, Rodan or Godzilla or Varan or whatever. It's just something completely different. And so what he comes up with, along with Tahiko Fukunaga and Yoshie Hota, is this novel called The Glowing Fairies in Mothra, and it's all about this, these 4 tiny fairies who are kidnapped from a South Seas island and brought as entertainment to the Japanese mainland, which then inspires this ancient god monster called Mothra to fly over and cause a bunch of massive destruction. Sekizawa takes this novel, he eliminates 2 of the fairies, he just makes it 2 fairies rather than 4, and he downplays a lot of the contemporary political influences that are going into the novel, because the novel itself is very much influenced about the role of the contemporary U.S. in Japanese society. Particularly, there's a lot of controversy in this period about the continued military presence of Americans in Japan and American military bases in Japan, and what rights the American military has and what sovereignty the Japanese people actually have in this scenario. So there's a lot of controversy about that. Sekizawa very much downplays that when he's adapting the story. He simplifies it, but he makes one critical change. The monster doesn't die at the end. The monster lives, and not only does the monster live, it's not supposed to be a tragic thing. The point is, the monster is the good guy. We're supposed to be cheering the monster on. So even as this monster is, going on this rampage throughout the earth, explicitly, we're supposed to be on the side of the monster. It's talk about that. When you were watching the movie, what was the main... Because you had mentioned that there was one clear influence that you saw narratively on the film, as far as the entire structure of it. The idea of, going to this island, kidnapping something, bringing it back for entertainment. You had noticed that it was very similar to a certain classic adventure film.
Right. Like King Kong or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
Right. Except King Kong was more ferocious, and it was less something although he still fell for him, because he was stolen from his property and taken for, making money.
He was a king in the world he knew, and it comes before human change.
But here I don't know why they do it. It's almost as if it was such a bad thing to do. They create a whole other kind of country to throw off the bad aspect of what's going on. So the Japanese are more of a research kind of thing, and the other ones are business people for this synthetic place. Right?
So this is something that's taken from the novel.
So it's all different, right?
Yeah, this is taken from the novel. So basically the first, just the basic premise opening the movie, there's a big storm. A fishing boat gets lost. Again, if you listen to our H-Man episode, you would get an idea that if there's a fishing boat at the beginning of these giant monster movies, it's a reference to the Lucky Dragon number 5 incident. It's very much, and like the Lucky Dragon number 5, there's the anxiety about radiation. This boat is lost in a storm. The only nearby island that they can land on is called Infant Island. Infant Island is thoroughly contaminated with radiation after a couple of nuclear experiments.
Right.
So the sailors there are 4 surviving sailors that are found and brought back to Japan. But what they discover is that they are not suffering from radiation poisoning. And so they're like, well, what the hell happened? We know that the place is bombed. And then they say, well, there were some natives on the island that gave us this berry juice. Maybe it immunized us to it. So again, we're already getting into the fantastic stuff. This would never happen in Godzilla or the H-Man or Rodan, where it's a fucking berry juice. What the hell does that mean? And it made you immune to the radiation? What does that mean? But here you still see the political elements that were in the original novel. What ends up happening is that the thing they're concerned about is not the berry juice. The thing they're concerned about is, wait, that island's supposed to be uninhabited. Right. And the people who carried out the experiment claimed that they had researched the island and determined that it was uninhabited before they carried out the experiments. And so immediately we cut to this press conference.
Gentlemen, the Rolisican government had made very sure, before these atomic tests were undertaken, that the island of Biru was virtually uninhabited. We're still not convinced that it is not. But the fact remains, we cannot explain the presence of these natives on the island at this time. It is our hope in the very near future to clarify matters.
So what's cool, so this nation is not America, it is Relishika. Relishika being in the original Japanese kanji, it's a portmanteau of the kanji for Russia and the kanji for America. And you can see this on the flag of Relishika's, because it's got like these red and white stripes, but it also has a weird like yellow moon and star in it. So like it's obviously supposed to have different elements of both Russia and America, but clearly this is America. Again, the movie doesn't go into it, and that's the thing. When Sekizawa is adapting this novel, he downplays these political elements that are much more fleshed out in the novel. He downplays that because, like, all right, I just want to tell an adventure story. I just want to get them to the island so that they can go on a crazy adventure, find the fairies, find the monster, yada, yada, yada. But what it's extrapolate, there already is there this kind of, it's not even like, it's not the same as H-Man or Godzilla, where it's like a dark, brooding allegory. The point is that, like, it's almost like it's funny. It's like it's comic sort of, poking fun at, like, it's like, it's Relishika, but we all know who this is supposed to represent and what this is implying about these people. That they're, they're lazy, they're feckless, they just wantonly carried out these experiments but didn't do the proper investigation to make sure that, no one would get hurt.
Right.
And the case against America, or Relishika, gets even worse from there, because then this is what keeps happening. The plot of the movie starts to get confusing. Because what ends up happening is that there is a Relishikan and Japanese co-research team that is going to be sent to the island to investigate whether there are any natives or not and to test it for radiation. So, but there's a guy who's apparently funding this trip named Nelson.
Please, now I'm sure you're all curious as to just why you won't be allowed to go on this expedition. Very well. It's a question of efficiency. That means that no one goes along unless they're needed.
Are you implying that the press would merely be in the way?
Under other circumstances, I know I would require you to help me. As it is now, the press will have to trust us.
Nelson is played by an American actor of both American and Japanese descent named Jerry Ito. He's the villain of our film, and we don't know much about him. Like, again, like, when the characters are talking about it, like, apparently he's, like, some sort of a artifacts robber and dealer.
Right.
But he also apparently at one point, like, did, like, a trip into, like, the sub-Saharan African jungle looking for, like, women to put on display or something. Like, really shady shit. And this is the guy with all the money that the American, like, who is apparently able to, like, convince the American government to let him fund the expedition. Because, like, this is the thing that's confusing, and it's not really fleshed out in the film, because what the guy from the American embassy, the guy who's doing the press conference, he says that the research team has no relationship to the Relishikan government, but then in the rest of the film, the characters act as if the only reason Nelson is there is more or less because he offered to fund the expedition himself.
Right.
So he's now this toxic influence who comes into the situation.
Well, obviously, has ulterior motives. Then they even talk about the fact they don't want to hand over the research.
He wants their research.
Right.
He wants.
They want the research to be pure. They don't want, but they even have that.
They don't want anyone capitalizing on it.
It's interesting because it plays into the. There's a Black Venus. I can't remember.
I think what you might be referring to is Sarah Bartman, or that was her given name by the people who captured and enslaved her. She was a South African woman who was exhibited as a freak pardon the expression, a freak show attraction in the 19th century. She was named the Hottentot Venus.
That's it, Hottentot Venus.
Yeah, Hottentot being the pejorative name that was given by the British to the Khoi people who she came from.
That's it.
And yeah,
that's
like
it. She's put on display, right?
Right. So that's clear. So I don't know.
Anyway,
if that's
I'm just the only reason I bring that up is that it has a parallel.
It has a parallel to what Nelson does,
right?
In the not only what he's said to have done, that, like, again, he's literally going to Africa to try to find pretty ladies to put on display, and, like, it's like this was actually fairly common, not just in the 19th century, but well into the early 20th century, this idea of taking indigenous peoples and not just putting them in, like, freak shows, but literally putting them in zoos. Like, literally putting them in cages and zoos on displays for, like, white people to gawk at, and, you know, like this was a... So, like, merely... So I don't know if this is an explicit reference to any of that in the movie.
No, there isn't.
But you're right.
Saying.
But you're right that it has
but
the parallels.
Plausible because,
it's plausible.
Yeah, it's plausible because we do it all the time. I mean,
Right.
not all the time, but it was done before. So,
but also that's what Jerry Ito's character does. That's what Nelson does. He kidnaps two beautiful indigenous women. Now they're a foot tall, but they're still, you know, native women that he's kidnapped. Again, there's like...
Well, they have to say they're human beings. You can't capture them and bring them back to...
Yeah.
You have to free them. He said, they're property. They're my property. And you
yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, there's even a moment where he's, like, in the club where, like... So, basically, he brings them, you know, like, under his own cover because the expedition... That's the thing. The expedition actually... Okay. The expedition finds that the island is not contaminated with radiation. They find the two fairies... And they find the other natives, but as Nelson wants to kidnap the fairies, the natives come out to defend her. They return the fairies, everyone goes back to Japan. The entire research team just decides we're not going to say a fucking thing about this because we don't want anyone coming back to this island. Then Nelson goes back to the island, kidnaps the women, massacres the natives. It's like a really dark scene, like just a wholesale Indian massacre, basically.
Right.
And
machine guns.
Right. And then he comes back and does like a whole stage show, and it's like a reverse King Kong. Instead of going and getting the monster and bringing it back to put on display, you're going to get the pretty girl and put her on display, and you come back. But even in one scene, Nelson says that the girls are happy when they sing. It's like instantly I thought of like antebellum slavery. I thought of like defenses, like of the idea of like, well, you hear the slaves singing, clearly they must be happy with the lot in their life. You know, it's like, you know, it's very clearly like, you know, an allegory being made here.
No, absolutely. And I agree 100% with that.
But the irony of it is that, you know, this is a movie that for all intents and purposes is designed to be as light and as comical, and it's also very decadent. Like it has a much bigger budget than Toho's previous giant monster and tokusatsu films. It's widescreen, it's in full color, it features a famous hot Japanese vocal pop duo as the two twin fairies. Those are the Peanuts. What are their names? One sec. Emi and Yumi Ito. They were a very famous Japanese vocal pop duo, you know, and so they were a big get to be in the film. The movie itself cost like $560,000. So, like, we're even getting into the territory where it might not even be considered a B movie, because that's pretty expensive. Like, that's close to an A picture. But, like, it also has musical numbers. It's very lavishly done. There's whole dance sequences.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good sets.
So the
sets are really well done. There's even the whole miniature prehistoric kind of set done.
Yeah.
With molds and things like that they're, you know, they're trying to show that there's a whole separate part of the island they didn't know about.
Right.
Even when they were there initially.
Like, the natives kind of live underground. It's really interesting. And but ultimately, despite all of this lightness, of tone, this more adventurous quality, very loose science, much more like a fantasy, despite all that, it's still this, like, expressly, like, political film.
Absolutely.
Like, no matter what second...
It's almost like as they couldn't help themselves.
Right, exactly. Like, you know, it's like...
As light as he wanted to make it, he still couldn't help himself, and he put stuff in.
Yeah.
When he was chosen to write this. So, and it's packed. It's
packed. Like, that's the thing. I don't know if he even wrote that stuff in. I just think, like, when he was adapting the novel, like, maybe there was just, like... Maybe he just said, nah, that sounds like a plausible way to get from point A to point B, not really thinking that, like, oh, this is like an evisceration of, like, America's history of imperialism and slavery. And this is the other thing, is that, like, you know, Sekizawa wasn't even the anti-capitalist. Takeshi Kimura, the guy who did the screenplay for Rodan, for the H-Man, he was the fucking communist.
Right.
But, like, none of the previous giant monster films are as explicitly anti-capitalist as this is. Like, this is explicitly, like, just like this random gangster just pays the American government enough money that he just says, yeah, I'm gonna go on this expedition. Like, you know, it's like this, and then he just, like, and of course, what does capitalism do? It extracts from the environment, and then everything starts to fall apart.
Right.
Like, you know, it's like like you could not get a more like simplified and distilled sort of anti-capitalist message than you do in Mothra. And so it's like it's a very compelling movie. Like, I find it very interesting just how much of it.
Man, that's why I didn't remember it when I was a kid, because it really got to start to get more complicated.
Yeah.
Because if you didn't follow the whole, it's about, I would say, what, half the movie doesn't have any Mothra in it at all.
Yeah. Mothra doesn't
it's
appear
all the
until,
development
yeah,
about all these kinds of characters and interactions. You have some comic relief of the reporter, who turns out to be very competent.
Yeah, Frankie Sakai plays a
Right.
reporter whose
Right.
nickname is the Snapping Turtle because he never lets go.
Right.
You know, never
So
lets
he's
go.
really well done. I think he does a really good job. I think, you know, I think, again, these are one of the films that people should revisit if they saw them when they were kids, just to get the flavor of what Ian is pointing out in terms of all these little references and all these metaphors within the film that are very, very. I mean, when I saw I don't even remember that they're actually Newkirk City. Come on,
Newkirk City. Yes. Okay.
how much?
Okay. So eventually,
That's
like,
almost as bad as Wendy Croy, who takes.
this is the great thing, because like, so the song that the fairies, that the Peanuts sing when they're on display, is the song that is invoking and beckoning Mothra to come destroy everything so that they can be freed. And it's this wonderful contrast between like the fairies and Mothra. Because, you know, the fairies are very nice, they're very polite to everyone, and they're just like, but like, they can't control what Mothra does. All they can do is ask for Mothra's help, but they even say that Mothra doesn't know the difference between good and evil. It's literally just a pure sort of natural
drive,
force.
right? But it's right. It's interesting though. They would have done all right if they didn't take off that shield. But they thought that the Mothra...
Then Mothra would just get agitated, because it already heard them singing, and they don't develop the shield in time, so it already would hear them, and
Right.
so it would come, and if it stopped hearing the singing, who knows, it might just assume they're dead and like go on a
Go on a
fucking
rampage,
rampage,
right.
and destroy it.
That's true. But the idea is that they think...
They develop a mechanism to block the radio signals from the singing, which is just this shield that they put over the cage.
Right, and
Very hard
that's when it was a
science.
larva, though. So it was still a larva yet, and so...
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Like, it starts out just as a caterpillar,
Right.
just running along, just minding its own. It's very cute. Mothra is an adorable little
Right.
monster. It's very much but this, yeah, like the destruction it goes on.
In fact, the only thing that's left of it that reminds you that it was the caterpillar is the mouthpiece.
Yeah, like then Mothra, yeah. So Tokyo Tower, it goes to Tokyo Tower, it
Makes its
collapses, it
cocoon.
makes its cocoon.
On Tokyo Tower.
And so,
Right, well, it's
then
all-
when it emerges, it's a full-grown moth, and it has like, yeah, it's like, and it's a beautiful monster, you know. It's like, and then it flaps its wings, and all of the military is scattered. But here's the other thing, and Steve Ryfle and Ed Godziszewski, they did like the audio commentary for the DVD release that I'm using for Mothra. And one thing that they note is that, okay, so what ends up happening is that once it becomes clear that Mothra is going to come to Japan and go on a rampage, what the Rylishikan government does is they said, all right, don't worry, we're going to bring in these atomic heat ray cannons for our, these newly designed special atomic heat ray cannons for use against the.
We'll
get rid of that bug problem for you.
We'll get rid of that cocoon for you.
Yeah, but here's the thing: is that the thing is that about that contrivance of the plot is that deploying atomic weapons violates Japan's 3 non-nuclear principles.
Oh, I see.
After the Second World War, Like Japan, like, you know,
Right, they're not a military power. Right.
Well, it's not that just that Japan is not a military power. It's that literally you cannot have nuclear weapons in Japanese territory at this time. There is a full-scale ban on thermonuclear weapons. So merely the fact that this government is just sort of rolling in with these nuclear weapons, totally violating international treaties. Like, again, you get, like, this impression of just, like... And it just flies by in the movie. Like, it's totally, like, it's almost satiric the way it's handling it. Because,
well,
like,
but after all, they were the source of the problem, so they're going to say they're going to go try to fix it. So they offer Japan the opportunity to use these ray guns to take care of the problem.
And who knows, maybe it did make the problem worse. Maybe it did just warm up the cocoon and the caterpillar said, ooh, how toasty, you know.
Right. A day later, that's it. And then they take the shield off, right?
Oh, yeah, yes. Well, Nelson escapes. Because, okay, so that's the other thing. It's like, after, like, weeks of, like, the Relishikins pussyfooting about telling Nelson to... Because that's the thing, is that, like, the first response of the Relishikin government is when the Japanese reporters are saying that Nelson needs to free the fairies. Of course, the first response of the Relishikin government is, we defend our citizens' property rights. Like, literally, this is a line in the movie. And it is only once it becomes clear that there's a giant caterpillar that's going to come destroy Tokyo that the Relishikin government says, okay, now Nelson needs to give up the fairies and, you know, submit them to the Japanese authorities. But Nelson just escapes. He just flees. He gets some forged documents. And I did notice that it was like a Relishikin army service guy who is the one who ultimately like looks at Nelson's forged documents and says, here, help your way through. So he goes back to New Kirk City, or some suburb of New Kirk City. Like, it's wonderful. It's wonderful, like, the conception of because they're still trying to hedge their bets here. Because New Kirk City, it looks like kind of a combination of New York City and San Francisco. But there's also, like, these mountains, like these beautiful mountains just outside of the cityscape that are more like a Washington area, or like a or Oregon,
or California,
or Northern California. But there's also like these quaint little like Dutch looking suburbs.
What the hell is that all
with
about?
like these Orthodox looking churches with their apparel. But anyway, so Nelson escapes to America. And he takes the mask off the fairies, but then Mothra knows where the fairies are, and so Mothra just flies all the way to America and just starts wrecking shit in New Kirk City. And here's a hilarious thing about the production of the movie. Originally, that was an idea that was written in the film, but as they were going into production, they just decided, we don't have enough money to do this. We're just going to make it a simpler ending where Nelson is still in Japan, Mothra, like, corners him on a mountain, and then, like, he falls off a cliff or some shit. Columbia, the American distributors, they said, whoa. No, you've got to have had a scene where it attacks New York City. You've got to have a scene where Mothra comes to America and starts wrecking shit. It's like, you know, like you got to have that scene. And so they front them even more money so that they can have the scene of America. And this isn't the first time, this isn't the last time this will happen. Like in Mothra versus Godzilla, there was another thing where like part of the international distribution deal with the company that picked up Mothra versus Godzilla was that the American distributor stipulated that Toho needed to film a scene especially for the American version that showed the American Navy attempting to fight Godzilla. But the whole thing you wonder is like, well, what's the point? They're just going to lose against Godzilla. Like, what is even like the...
What's the thing about building a landing strip? Remember that?
Okay.
With the markings to get the...
Okay.
That's in that's in
this is the other
Relistica, right?
I hope it's clear by now that like I really love Mothra. Like it's one of my favorite giant monster movies. And it's not just because the monster is a hero who lives at the end. It's because it has one of the most bizarre conclusions to a science fiction or a monster movie that has ever been thought of. So one of the scientists, the Japanese scientist, and therefore you can tell they're good because they're Japanese and they're scientists. That's the other thing, like an emergent motif of like, in Japanese movies, scientists are noble, reporters are noble, they fight for the good cause. It's like governments and capitalists who are the bad guys. Like always governments and capitalists are the bad guys. One of the scientists who's like a expert in like South Seas island cultures and languages, he is able to find a tablet which is written in like the native language of the infant islanders, and there's a symbol that keeps appearing on it, which is the
Four
symbol.
times.
Yeah, appears 4 times, and it's the symbol for Mothra. Now, it's basically... Now, here's the interesting thing about this symbol.
Which is really funny, because he took a pencil etching of it, right? He put a piece of paper over it.
Yeah, where did he get the paper?
I have no idea.
Nelson also has a map of Infant Island, and that also never comes to anything. Where did he get the map?
It almost has the Skipper.
Right, exactly. It's like a King Kong element that,
right.
But it doesn't
Someone
fit.
That gets killed, and they
yeah, exactly. It's I guess I don't know. Maybe he found it in Africa, but that's the other thing. Nelson is a great villain. There's just so little we know about him, so it doesn't really matter what he does. Everything is explicable. But so the interesting thing about Mothra's symbol is that when you look at it, and especially in the opening credits, because
it looks like
it looks like a Christian cross.
The Christian cross with the... Right.
It looks like a Christian cross almost with a halo of light around it.
Yep.
And it's really noticeable in the opening credits, because in the opening credits, in the credits for Ishiro Honda and Tomoyuki Tanaka and Eiji Tsuburaya, all three of them, it's juxtaposed right next to the Mothra symbol. But you notice in that version of the symbol, the bottom, on the vertical line, the bottom half of it is just slightly longer than it is in its normal representation, because they're all equidistant in the regular symbol we appear in the movie, but it's a little bit more like a crucifix in the opening credits.
It's like what's the symbol that they put on chasubles, right? It's really right. It's like that with the... I forget what they call that particular symbol, but Christianity symbol. Yeah. There's a lot of... And that's interesting. So they make a...
And this is the thing, is that, but what ends up happening in the movie is that, okay, so Nelson is cornered in a suburb of the Dutch town, the suburb of New York City. The police are there, but because it's America, everybody has fucking guns. The militia is out looking for Nelson. But there's this great scene, because as Nelson is cornered in his car by the police and the militia, he's looking out his window and he starts seeing the faces of all the natives he killed. So now he's associating these people with the natives. Right. He tries to run away. He kills a cop in the process, but he gets shot down. The Japanese arrive just in time with the ferries, and everyone is huddled around this church. And then they hear the bells, and everyone's it's time to pray for mercy.
Here's what's really strange, and I can't figure out that part. Apparently, the bells that play at the church are very similar to the sound of the girls singing, right?
It's the same. It's the same.
How can it be?
The chiming of the bells is the same as the melody.
Do you remember this? The inscription from the cave. Right? Now look up there. I think I see. This must have some sort of religious significance. Like the cross, right?
Listen. When you hear the bells, they sound like the girls' voices to me.
Say, Jojo, I wonder, since there's a similarity in the cross and the sound, could we use it? I don't know how. If we could, it would really do the trick for us. Use the bells.
I don't understand that at all.
Well, I don't understand that part, but I also don't understand why... Okay, so what? Okay, anyway. So yeah, they're praying for mercy from God. The American Christians are, but then the scientist realizes that, oh hey, the Mothra symbol looks exactly like the Christian cross, and then the song sounds exactly like Mothra's song, and so the plan they devise is They go to an airstrip. They make a giant Mothra symbol in the airstrip using chalk.
So now Mothra reads.
But then they get all of the church bells in Newkirk City to play the song simultaneously to calm Mothra. Mothra stops her rampage. She lands on the airstrip.
Right, she even say, Mothra looks like she's getting a little bit, Mothra looks like he's getting a little more calmer.
Yeah. You get less agitated.
Right.
So, you know, like the soothing of the monster, and then the fairies go on the back of the monster, and they go back home. So, like, it doesn't... That was the thing you were wondering is how the bells were all ringing the same tune in time. The thing I'm wondering is, why don't they just take the fairies to an airstrip and just put them out there and let them sing? Who gives a fuck? We already know that, like, there's no noise cancellation. Mothra can hear them from, like, fucking miles away. It doesn't matter.
No, because it's telepathy.
But here's the thing.
If it's telepathy, why do you have to sing?
Exactly. But
they have to break... That's what the thing did. It stopped the brainwaves, right? Because
take them out of the brainwaves thing. Just put them out there. Who cares? But it didn't have to be this elaborate. Like but that's the thing is that, like, they couldn't really help themselves. Like this is one of those movies where it's like in the writing process the steam just got going.
No, I tell you why. That is their expiation. They're atoning for that one person's rose eclipse. So they're all...
You think it's necessary...
They're all blessing themselves, praying to whatever...
They just understand intuitively that it's not enough to give the fairies back. We have to show Mothra that we're really sorry.
That collectively they're all part of the same sin.
Right. It's like it's atonement.
Yeah.
We're asking Mothra for forgiveness or God for forgiveness.
What a terrible fuck. I mean,
well, like, here's the thing: it's sacrilegious as all hell. But like coming from a Japanese perspective, that's not entirely.
Well, maybe the Greek Orthodox it isn't. I don't know.
Yeah, like who knows about those wackos?
Because he blesses himself backwards, right?
Yeah. That's the great thing. Yeah, but that's the thing is that, like, you know, so there's this. Obviously, what ends up happening here is that the plot of the plot of the movie is more or less about how scientific rationalism and capitalism and a totally materially driven society only brings about chaos. It brings about our own destruction. The only way to atonement, particularly between Rolishika, scare quotes, and Japan, the only way to atonement is not materialism. Capitalism isn't going to solve it. Japan just opening itself up to, like, the greedy Nelsons of the world, the slave drivers and capitalists. That's not going to fix the problem.
It's Christianity.
Well, it's spiritual universalism.
It's like explicitly. It's almost as if. That's the weirdest thing. If anything, I thought it would be like the Buddhists and the Catholics would get together. But they don't.
Well, no, it's a spiritual universalist thing. Because Mothra is this primordial pagan creature. And they even talk about that. Like, do you know the theory that the Polynesian islands used to be one single continent? Just like the theory of Atlantis. So the premise is that this is pre-Christian, pre-flood. Like, this is like an ancient society. But Mothra's symbol just happens to be the same one that
it's like Alien versus Predator, where that thing in the ground has all these different religions.
The root. Well, it's like it's standard, like, you know, like it's a root language. It's this thing that, like, it's this logos, like this spiritual truth that permeates
regardless of what religion.
Right, exactly. We are all together. We are all one. Buddhist, Shinto, Christian, pagan. It doesn't matter. So Mothra's symbol is that of the cross. But yeah, so that's the only way to resolve the conflict is a spiritual universalism and a coming together and a recognition of our mutual sin and atonement. And it is interesting because despite the fact that the Mothra symbol looks a lot like a Christian cross, the thing that I realized that it looks a little bit more like, if you just turn it on its side a bit so that it's more like an X rather than a cross, the thing that I realized is that it looks a lot like the symbol, the crest of a Shinto shrine called in Kyoto called the Yasuka Jinja, formerly known as the Gion Jinja. This is a Shinto temple in Kyoto where their crest was appropriated by Japanese Christians during the Tokugawa shogunate when Christians were being persecuted in Japan.
This thing's loaded.
This thing is loaded.
It's like sirloin of steak.
No, hey, follow up. I already told you that. I had told Dad after we had watched it because I knew it back then. And that's the great thing about the scene where they're both in the church, is that one of the characters just starts praying to the cross, and it's Yuki. I actually forget what the character's name is. The photographer girl, Michi, played by Kyoko Kagawa. This is a star-studded cast, actually. Frankie Sakai was a big comedy player.
The guy who played in the Monster.
The Manster.
He played the scientist in the Manster. He was one of Nelson's collaborators, right?
Yeah.
I forget who he is.
Frankie Sakai was a big comic star at the time. Kyoko Kagawa was in a lot of Akira Kurosawa films.
That's right.
This is
I forgot about that.
She was in Throne of Blood, I think.
Right.
Anyway, so it's a great little scene because she starts praying to the cross, which is just this sudden implication that the character is Christian, out of nowhere, and it's but also Frankie Sakai, he attempts to do the sign of the cross, but he does it wrong.
He does it the Greek way.
Because he does it the Greek way. but here's the thing that's funny.
I'm sorry, the Orthodox.
Yeah, Frankie Sakai, it turns out, was a Christian. He was Roman Catholic. And I only found out about this a while ago. Eiji Tsuburaya, the special effects guy, he converted to Roman Catholicism after he married his wife. So there's this element of the story which is all about this idea of... So on the one level, it's the pagan this sort of pagan origin, almost representing Japan's own primordial origins. It's deeply, literally like Mothra, hidden in the earth. It is one with nature. It is this thing that is intrinsic to the Japanese culture and nature, but which over time is transmuted and translated and influenced by other cultures till we get to Christianity, but it's the same fundamental symbol. Yeah. But there's also
it's a distillation, right?
Right,
it's
exactly.
A compendium of those,
Right. It's like a secular mask of something that has always existed.
And it glows, sort of like St. Elmo's fire.
Yeah, exactly.
It's got a certain,
But there's also this inverted symbolism, or this allegory that the film is referring to, which is the idea of Christianity itself being repressed and hidden in Japanese history. So basically since, Japanese, Catholic missions to Japan began really in earnest in the mid-16th century. It was during this period, there were some Japanese Shinto and Buddhists and Confucianists.
You're right. But didn't Jesus, wasn't it the theory that when Jesus disappeared for so many years, he actually traveled? And that's where he picked up a little Buddhism?
Whose theory?
When you look at the history of Jesus, if you see any of these made-for-TV documentaries...
Are you talking about some History Channel quack documentary?
No, it's not a quack documentary. Where he disappears, some people think that he
didn't disappear, he got killed.
No, when he disappeared for 3 years. Remember, he disappeared. He goes away, you don't see him until he's 33. So he leaves.
Well, that's a lot longer than 3 years.
Right, he's gone for a long time. And apparently they say when he comes back, and in fact, there's historical documentation of someone foreign going to Asia, picking up Buddhism, and
sounds like potentially a lot of people.
I'm not only trying to tell you that it feeds into this. So even though this was done in the 60s or 50s,
okay. So let's. I think you're right.
But
it dovetails a little bit because so
it has the same kind of elements.
All right, yeah, but let me. I'm going to be able to connect that. There was a hostility at first, but more or less you could practice, Christianity in Japan for a time because there was no real centralized government. Different shoguns or daimyos would react with different extremity or different apathy to the presence of Christians, especially if they were engaging in good trade with the Spaniards and Portuguese. A lot of them just didn't give a fuck who was...
Sure, because the Silk Railroad, right? Silk Railroad was very important, right, at the time.
Yeah. It wasn't really until the basically the unification of the shogunate under Toyotomi Toyotomi Hideyoshi, that what you see is the beginning of the systematic persecution of Christians, and eventually with Ieyasu Tokugawa, the implementation of a policy that's called sakoku, which means literally closed country. This idea that very few foreign nationals are getting in, no common native-born Japan is ever getting out, and Christianity is strictly forbidden. And so this lasts about until the mid-19th century. So we're talking about a period from the 16th century to the mid-19th century where Christianity is virulently persecuted. All Christian practice is forced underground. And so what eventually emerges are these unique clandestine Catholic communities in Japan that are called kakure karishitan, literally hidden Christians.
What does that sound like?
Kakure karishitan?
No, what does that sound like in Rome when they went underground?
Hidden Christian?
Hidden Christian. When they used to hide in Rome, the catacombs, right? They used to,
right.
They used to, when they were persecuted, they went underground, and it plays into the island. The island is the piece of writing on the rock is a glyph, right, of some type.
It's gonna get even closer than that. So basically, so the thing that's interesting about the kakure karishitan is that
notes before I come. Maybe they help be useful.
Here's the thing, though.
But then it would.
But then we would have to. But then we would have to rely on you to half explain it. But. Okay, so here's the thing. The Karishitan, they maintain their Catholic practices and rituals in secret. They were often under the direction of missionaries who were illegally remaining. They couldn't print and disseminate their own scriptures and letters, so everything had to be passed down orally. One practice that some Kakure Karishitan adopted was the idea of venerating images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, but disguising them as traditional representations of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. So, I mean, how different is that from Mothra? Like, literally a Christian cross disguised as this pagan symbolism. Nonetheless, so what ends up happening is, with the expulsion of most Catholic clergy and the systematic killing of martyrdom of others, basically, a lot of these Kakure Karishitan communities, they become officiated by lay people. And so for literally a century and a half, you have this lay community of Catholics who are sort of fusing together Catholic teachings that are all transmitted orally with their own native folk religions and their cult of ancestor worship. And so you get what is this canonical Karishitan text called the Tenchi Hajimari no Koto, or the beginning of heaven and earth. Now, basically, it's an abbreviated version of both the Genesis myths and the Gospels of the Bible, with obvious elements of Shinto and Buddhist influence. Like, the creation myth has elements of the Shinto creation myth. And like what you were saying, in their version of the Christ story, there is a part where Christ goes on his mission. During his early life, Christ goes into East Asia and into China and meets the Buddha and actually, like, literally has a conversation with the Buddha. And the Buddha, of course, because it's this now syncretic religion, there's a part in this canonical text where the Buddha basically, it's like this sort of like John the Baptist, but it's a Buddhist version. Like, it's you are truly an enlightened one. Right, you have the bona fides. And the Virgin Mary herself is venerated as the incarnation of a goddess. So it's this very, so what ends up happening is with the Meiji Restoration, which basically means that power is consolidated in Japan under a central imperial authority. The shogunate is gotten rid of, the samurai are gotten rid of. There's this rapid period of modernization, cultural, economic, industrial, everything, including a lot of religious secularization. So the Kakure are allowed to come out of hiding, and most of them, once they're reintroduced to the Catholic Church, and of course the Catholic Church says, okay, so you've made a lot of, embellishments in the time we were gone, but just renounce these and you can just come back into the church sight unseen. You don't need to be rebaptized again. And most of them do, but a lot of them keep their keep their syncretic faith, and they become known as the Hanari Kirishitan, or the separated Christians. So they are a very extreme minority in Japan. In fact, today they're more or less extinct. But, like, you know, they had lived, you know, basically isolated in a lot of the same places where these early Catholic communities initially fled during the Tokugawa shogunate. And that this, you know, well into the 1980s, these communities were being rediscovered, like, a lot of times on, like, literal islands, like, you know, it's not unlike Infant Island. Like, there's on this place where we didn't think it was inhabited, but, like, oh, there's this hidden society of cross-worshipping, syncretic, pagan, and Christian peoples that are now on the verge of extinction. So you're absolutely right, is that, like, once you actually get into the history, the unique history of, like, the interplay between Christianity and folk religion in Japan, you start to see that there's maybe, like, you know, maybe not deliberate, but there's definitely, like, a sort of motivated interlacing of this unique history with the text that makes, you know, there's still no logical explanation. It still makes no logical sense why all the bells in New Kirk City would all be able to play Mothra's melody. But it gives an explanation of, like, what the symbolism
Well, but their
is. Christianity
Christianity was based on that ancient,
right,
that's still preserved or is underground, and maybe it isn't that far-fetched, that that the chant or whatever it was of those bells, just like Gregorian chant, it persisted. Even though you lost the history of where it came from, nevertheless, they were retained. So, like I said, the movie has so much hidden value to it. But like, you would never know it. Any Joe Schmo watching it, I just get it superficially because I said, looks like a Christian symbol to me. You know,
and then you see the end of the movie and you're like, okay, now I know I'm not seeing things. Like,
right.
They're trying to tell me something.
Yeah,
here.
but I didn't realize that if you turn it on its side, that it's a symbol for in the Japanese as well. And so it's very interesting. It's a very interesting. So
I just thought of something else. Mothra, the caterpillar version, comes to Japan, is persecuted upon its arrival.
It's hung on a cross.
Goes to a tower that falls over, like it's hung on a tower, and then is resurrected as a being that ascends into the heavens.
Right.
We've unlocked it. Like,
right.
So this is the other weird
Christian story.
Yeah, it's the story. It's in an allegory of Christ dressed up as a giant monster movie. And who are Mothra's main messengers on Earth? Who are the ones to say that Christ's message is living? 2 women. It's all a Christian allegory.
Right.
This movie is so much fun.
It is.
It is so wild.
I doubt very much that they didn't have that in mind when they wrote this stuff.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it. Like, there's no way. Like I think
this happens to be the most overt movie that has overtones of trying to write everything in.
Yeah, they try to throw everything in, and in the process, it's just the most beautiful, head.
Most people watching would not get any part. You have to really examine it.
Well, that's the thing, is that, like, I always I'm like always predisposed to, like, a Marxist reading of films. I think that's fairly clear at this point. But it's very rare that you get a movie like Mothra that is just so, like, but not just explicit, but just, like, casual. Like, yeah, capitalism is kind of the root of all evil, but also blended together with just, like, but also, like, materialism can't really solve the impending spiritual crisis of our country. The only thing that's going to bring us together is, like, some sort of redeemer or some kind.
Right, and all the gunpowder in the world, including an atomic ray gun, thermonuclear ray gun.
Yeah, it sort of suggests that, like, you know, like, within
all the weapons in the world aren't going to stop a COVID-19 virus.
Right. It's almost like within 15 years, it's almost like just with that one scene of the atomic ray guns, it almost suggests like the anxiety is pretty much gone. Like, now it's just been replaced with like an almost like a sarcastic acceptance.
Right.
That, like, yeah, these assholes are gonna be here and we're gonna be dealing with this.
Right.
But, and it's sort of what I'm wondering is that, like, there's still this like the anxiety seems to be leaving, and it's almost like, you know, like, because it's so explicit politically, but the actual context in which it appears, like, it's almost like nihilistic to a certain extent. It, because, like, for me, it's like even a little difficult to like take like the optimistic conclusion seriously. Like, for, like, I guess it works like if you're like a young person, like, I guess it works that if you're like the sort of juvenile target audience of a movie like this, but like, you know, it almost makes me feel like, you know, this is sort of the beginnings, isn't it? It's the monster as a hero, but what the monster is heroic for is because it sort of lashes out for us, doesn't it? It sort of destroys, and like Mothra, it just kind of destroys indiscriminately.
Right.
It doesn't know the difference between
Because
good
Japan
and
gets
evil.
destroyed too.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it doesn't, parts of it anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, look at the dark stuff, but overall, I very much enjoy this movie. And any final thoughts, or do you think?
No, I think you're 100% right. I think it's, like I said, this is a movie that combines so many different elements to it, that when you look at it, you know, just the way it's written, it's a good story just by itself. Even if you don't look at all the heavy symbolism in it. But yeah, I mean, it's really, it goes to show you how much goes into something like this. And they had enough time to do it, which is interesting because it's a long movie.
Yeah.
What's it run? It's more than an hour. It's more than an hour and a half, isn't it?
It's close. It's close to an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah, so it's long enough to develop these. So you don't lose a lot. So it's developed quite well. I
mean, once again, it's not even really a B movie. It's like more of a. It's
more
more of a like a sort of George Pal-esque, like extravagant, like sort of disaster or fantasy adventure movie, albeit with a giant bug in it. But yeah, like it's very much a. You know, and that was something that they intended going in, is that they were trying to write something of a lighter fare. And, you know, explicitly, like Ishiro Honda, I think, like I was reading a biography written about him. And, you know, he was quoted as saying, you know, they wanted something more like a Disney movie or a Hollywood musical. So there is this juvenile sensibility to it. And I guess the thing that it begins this trend. It begins the trend that is so unique to Japanese giant monster films that you don't see anywhere else in the world, or virtually nowhere else in the world, which is the idea of the monster as the hero. Right. And so just from here, like, it doesn't begin with Godzilla, it begins with Mothra. From here we see even when Godzilla comes back, you know, in King Kong versus Godzilla, in Mothra versus Godzilla, in Ghidorah the three-headed monster, Godzilla is always a bad guy. Godzilla is always a guy who's just going around destroying things. And if you notice, in Ghidorah the three-headed monster, it's Mothra who has to bring Godzilla and Rodan around to being good guys. Right. It's almost like Mothra like spreads the message of like universal love to the giant monsters, right, and is able to give us the sort of Godzilla superhero.
I've been here before, right.
I've been there before. Yeah, it's like a giant monster scared straight program. You start by destroying one city, then you're destroying whole continents. All right, I'm sure we've learned a lesson from this one, right, Rocco?
We have. Crime doesn't pay. You don't steal the girls from the island.
Yeah, and I guess crime does not pay even if it's a crime against humanity. Like, don't do slavery, don't bomb places. Don't bomb places in general, but especially don't bomb places without figuring out if they're inhabited. And yeah, also, like, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. I think that fits the message of the movie pretty well.
No, it's a good movie. I think that everybody should, like, if you saw this when you were a kid and you're 68, 69, it's worth revisiting these movies. These, when you think about it, these are packed better than some of the other more recent films are done with bigger budgets and they're done with better actors or better, you know, special effects, and these movies are packed with a lot of symbolism, and it's really a shame that, you know, we sort of like cast them off as being this whole, you know, bailiwick of sort of like lesser movies, when in reality they're actually quite,
like almost like the half formed beginnings of like some. Yeah, but like there's definitely
really a lot in this. These well, they're pretty brilliant people when you get to
Well, definitely, definitely experienced people.
Yep.
Definitely people who have
and they
lived through a war
they hadn't gotten jaded. They're real professionals. They, like you just said,
it's a beautifully made movie.
They led up to certain points. And how can you start with something unique and still do something? Yeah. And they did it. They did it here. Is it a perfect movie? Absolutely not.
Yeah, it drags.
But like I said, you have to, again, a lot of it has to do with the subtitles.
For a movie that's a lot comedy, a lot of the comedy is really dire.
Right. Well,
or maybe it's cultural.
Well,
like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if, like, Frankie Sakai is a lot funnier if I'm Japanese than if I'm... To me, he just kind of looks like a mugging fat guy.
Yeah, really.
And I've had enough mugging fat guys. I usually don't like mugging fat guys.
Yeah, it's just, like you said, it does wear on you, but it's not that overbearing where it detracts that much from the movie.
Yeah.
Right? He's the Jimmy Olsen of against Clark Kent and Lois Lane. He's the character that you see in a lot of these movies where,
He's the hero reporter. He's the guy who's always on the side.
And Mr. White is what's his name?
Perry White, his editor.
The head editor.
Yeah.
He has the
same... Amano, played by Takashi Shimura.
Which is a very famous guy.
Yeah,
he's been in a lot of movies.
Famous. Yeah, he's been in a lot of shit.
Right.
But yes.
Worthwhile seeing. I definitely recommend that people revisit some of these.
Absolutely.
Thank you, good friends. Thank you for letting us return to our island. Our wish for you is that you will have peace and happiness.
Thank you very much. And we hope that no one ever disturbs you or your island again.
Thank you. Mothra awaits us. Sayonara.